Russia's private sector is increasingly looking like a meltdown is imminent. For small and medium businesses, the ones that non-oligarchs work at, the economy already looks totally cooked. Just how much longer can Russia's private sector hold on? Plus, we're going to talk about the unusual circumstances that led to a North Korean colonel ending up fighting on the front lines with 2 automatic weapons. And, of course, we're going to talk about a Ukrainian brigade having a tough time fighting in Pokrovsk, and why all the headlines about the latest Russian town that they've seized is probably just a lot of nonsense. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is one of the most interesting stories. The Russian economy is, of course, looking to be in pretty bad shape. This is, of course, for particularly small and medium-sized companies, right? Which in an economy, right, you have some of these behemoths, think like publicly traded companies, but then you have small and medium businesses, which make up in most developed economies a large portion of the economic activity. This can range from one-man plumbing and electrician operations all the way up to small manufacturers, importers, exporters, right? When you drive around your town, whether it's in the United States or Europe, you're likely going to see the majority of enterprises are actually these small and medium businesses, right? And in Russia, where there is a strong stratification in their social and political landscape, right, where you have oligarchs who own basically all of the large businesses. In fact, you cannot grow a large business in Russia without essentially becoming an oligarch or selling it to one of the oligarchs, effectively becoming sort of their patron, right? And so those oligarchs remain very protected. They have access to better loans. They have access to commercial capital resources that the average Russian doesn't. The problem is, though, that collectively the average Russian still holds most of the economic power in Russia, right? It's not North Korea. And those average Russians are getting crushed by basically 3 steamrollers rolling over them at once. The first is, of course, extremely high interest rates, right? We know that for most small and medium businesses, loans are the lifeblood of these businesses, right? Most of the time, very few businesses can operate on a cash basis, right? Because think about it. If you want to sell cars, you have to buy the cars from the dealership before you can sell them to customers. That means that you have to put cash up front, and you have to hope that you can sell enough cars to make cash on the back end, right, to pay off that loan. And if you want to grow your business, which almost all small and medium businesses want to grow, by definition, if you sold 10 cars last year and this year you want to sell 20 cars, you won't have the cash to buy 20 cars. You have 10 cars worth of cash. So you, by definition, have to get a loan, right? So loans are the lifeblood of so many small and medium businesses. And last year, Russia's central bank hiked interest rates to a record high of 21%. And in fact, a lot of people think that the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, wanted to hike it even further, but that Putin himself or someone at the Kremlin appears to have intervened and said, no more rate hikes. It is too difficult already for small and medium businesses to get loans. But remember, also, when a Russian needs a car loan, right? When a Russian needs a loan, a personal line of credit, right? Almost anything is going to require a high interest loan. And when you're talking about 20% plus, guys, that is the equivalent of the worst of US credit card companies, right? That's something like more than double what even a terrible low credit score car loan in the US would be. And so this is really cooking these Russian businesses. Because remember, guys, the prime rate right now is about 4%. If you go to a car dealership and you have perfect credit to get a brand new car, you are going to end up paying, about 9%, right? Maybe 8% if you do it through like a really good credit union. And if you have less than perfect credit, unstable employment history, some dings on your credit report, you're going to be looking at 10 to 12%. So imagine if the prime rate is 21%, what those loans look like. They could be probably as high as 30+%. So that's one of the steamrollers hitting Russian businesses. But the other steamrollers, of course, are going to be plummeting sales. And that's because fewer and fewer Russians are able to spend their paychecks on these consumer goods, right? One, there's just not that many Russians left. Remember, you cannot pull 1 million people, particularly working age males, out of your economy and expect there to be no repercussions, right? And you also have a scenario in which the Russian ruble is not going as far. So people have to spend literally less of it, right? And they're not spending it at consumer goods. They're spending it on essentials, right? And finally, evaporating state support, right? A lot of these businesses, again, for Russia, a lot of them are subsidized, right? Russia, in order to keep certain things like affordable, for example, vodka is actually state subsidized. But you also see state subsidies in a lot of fuel prices, for example. And remember, if you are basically a grocery store owner, a convenience store owner, anyone in the food space, that price of vodka is going to impact you. Just like if you are basically anyone who isn't an internet-based business, you are going to be impacted by that rising gas prices, because the freight that moves your goods from place to place, right, is also powered by fossil fuels. So you have these evaporating state support, all of which are really pushing these businesses to the brink of disaster. In fact, one analysis found that nearly 1 in 4 Russian small businesses are on the brink of collapse, right? And just like the Great Recession, right, in the United States, the collapse didn't happen all at once. It was a crisis that boiled slowly over time, finally spilling over, just like any kind of exponential growth, right? At first, growing, let's say the crisis grows at 3% a month, right? It's going to start out barely distinguishable, but then one day that growth curve is going to take off. And that's what we're seeing here, I think. We're seeing more and more of these businesses absolutely get steamrolled by effectively the war economy, right? Crowded out by spending on just essentially defense industries. The fear that many people have is that Putin's only solution to this will be to further expand the war economy, that slowly more and more of the economy will have to be supported by the war. You're going to see, for example, if you're a grocery store that's going to go under, maybe the Russian government will have to step in and say, well, we're going to buy your groceries and send them to troops on the front lines, right? This kind of government spending, eating everything, is actually a danger in an economy that fully pivots to this war footing. And it's one of the dangers that actually the United States faced in the Second World War as the economy was winding down, right? The U.S. looked around and said, man, we've pivoted our whole economy to this fighting footing. And now we have all this manufacturing capability. We have all these factories, all these factory workers, and we have an influx of new workers coming into our economy. And the only reason the U.S. was able to avoid what would have been a potential disaster economically is because of the Marshall Plan, because we literally printed money and we gave it to, we didn't quite print the money because we were on a gold standard, but we loaned the money to European countries and said, take this money, put it in your pocketbooks. We know you don't have factories. So when you want to buy stuff, you have to buy it from us, the United States of America. And that system allowed the U.S. economy to pivot from a war footing to a peacetime footing. Putin doesn't have a Marshall Plan. That's the problem, right? And so he is going to be stuck where he has to keep his war machine running, but he also he can't keep the war up, but he also can't wind the war down. It's a tremendous sort of pressure cooker he's built for himself and his economy. Now, first off, before we talk about this unusual North Korean colonel who ended up fighting on the front lines, I wanted to say 2 things. First off, hit the subscribe button. That makes a difference. Second, if you need caffeine, and I get it, it's winter, dudes. There's no daylight. It is freezing everywhere. It sucks. So if you need a little bit of a pick-me-up, if you need the energy to crush this winter season, your secret weapon is going to be Strike Gum, right? This is the gum that was requested. We gave it to some FPV pilots in the 54th Brigade when I was in Ukraine. We gave it to everybody. But the 54th was actually the first ones to reach out and be like, we're out of gum, send more gum. So, it's the gum of choice of FPV pilots, right? And of course, cops, firefighters, pilots, or just fitness aficionados, all of them say, listen, we love this stuff. If you are someone who's spending $5 a pop on overpriced sugary energy drink, Strike Gum is the alternative, right? All the caffeine of an energy drink, none of the sugar, and it goes where you go. So check out the end of January sale, 20% off store-wide, and free shipping on orders over $50. The link is in the description. You can also get it on Amazon, but if you want those deals, you got to get it on strikegum.com. All right, let's talk about this insane North Korean colonel, right? So this is kind of one of those weird headlines, but this is coming from Kursk Oblast, the 22nd Mech. This is a brigade that, of course, we did a big fundraiser for when they pushed into Kursk. The 22nd Mech went into battle, taking out a North Korean assault. But what they found when they did their battle damage assessment was something unusual, namely a North Korean colonel, which for them is a company commander, right, was actually found KIA with all of his equipment, right? Now, a Ukrainian war correspondent actually got his hands on the kit and was able to assess it up close and personal. He said, quote, actually, the officer had a lot of high-quality equipment, but notably, he carried a Vepr 12, a unusual Russian-made shotgun. And what makes the Vepr 12 so unusual for a shotgun is that, well, it is a semi-automatic shotgun in an AK style. So the appeal is that if you know how to work an AK, you can work the Vepr 12, which is pretty nifty. But it's also semi-automatic, right? So every time you pull a trigger, you send another round down the barrel, which if you are running, for example, buckshot or even birdshot, this can be a really effective weapon system, particularly against FPV drones, right? This is something that we've seen elsewhere, that the best way to counter these FPV drones is actually with a shotgun. Why? Because a shotgun doesn't care if it is running on a fiber optic cable, if it's running from a signal, if it's an AI-powered drone, if it's a human drone, right? This is a really effective tool, but it's interesting that of the limited weight this infantry colonel could carry, he elected to carry a Vepr 12 semi-auto shotgun. Really an interesting choice, right? And they also acknowledged that, unlike a lot of Russian officers, this North Korean colonel went to battle with his own fighters, shoulder to shoulder, something that you don't usually see in post-Soviet era militaries. You see that more, that's more the expectation in Western militaries like the United States and Israel, where officers are expected to assume as much of the risk of the operation as they possibly can while maintaining effective command and control, right? Of course, he also was found with a diary whose contents we haven't disclosed, and Chinese-made radios, grenades, and his standard issue AK-12 assault rifle, right? And of course, the reporter noted that despite this heavy combat load, it was possible because North Koreans have extremely high standards for physical fitness, at least among their troops, at least among this elite troop that is currently deployed to Kursk Oblast. So, really fascinating to see this pervasion of shotguns across the front line. And some units that we talked to in Ukraine said, listen, the shotguns really aren't that effective. They only work at the very, very closest quarters. And if you get lucky and you are able to take the drone out of flight, there's no guarantee that it'll be so close that it won't continue on its path and hit close to you, right? It only is really going to work when the drone's within a few dozen meters. And if you've ever gone skeet shooting, you know that it's actually pretty possible to hit these kind of drones, but it's also only works when they're very close by. But still, an automatic shotgun should prove pretty effective. But fascinating to think that perhaps in the future, you may actually see skeet shooting ranges become real popular among combatants. A fascinating, fascinating turn of events for sure. Now, I want to take another look at a story here about the 157th Mechanized Brigade, which reportedly is, quote, disintegrating as it deploys to Pokrovsk. Now, this is the second time in a month that a newly formed Ukrainian brigade appears to be, they're just saying disintegrating as it deploys to the front line. disintegrating is not something like a unit can do, right? It can have personnel flee, it can have maintenance issues, but disintegrating is too broad and weird a term to really pin down what's going on here. But according to one relative of a 157th Brigade trooper, they said, quote, "This newly formed brigade did not undergo the necessary combat training, but it was immediately sent to the hottest areas, including Pokrovsk," right? Capturing Pokrovsk remains one of Russia's top objectives, but it's sort of bizarre that Ukrainian army is reinforcing it with newly formed, somewhat dysfunctional units, right? They describe, of course, they say this mirrored the problems of the other brigades in the 150th series, that soldiers were taken during the formation process, units hastily deployed to the front without proper training, resulting in heavy casualties. There's the 151st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and 59th that were formed in the last 2 years. And some of them got a lengthy period of training in which the brigade was able to gel and leadership was able to coalesce. And some of them appeared not to have. A typical brigade will have 2,000 manpower billets, but these brigades are about 4,000. However, they're fragile with inexperienced leaders, few modern armored vehicles, and a poor morale, right? Now, this is bizarre to me for a bunch of reasons. Is that you're way better off by integrating veterans and new recruits into a unit, right? Now, there's some cultural problems in that veterans often don't want to take the time to train up new recruits, many of whom may not want to be there, right? We're using recruit, but these are really conscripts. And so, but that is the responsibility of their command to sort of integrate these new soldiers into formations. And, you know, I give the Ukrainian military like some credit. I really thought the plan was to get like 1 or 2 of these new brigades, get them to the front line, and then be able to relieve an experienced brigade, and then use that month-long relief period to plus them up with new soldiers, do some training, get the crews to work together, get them feeling good about each other, and then you deploy a combat-experienced formation with some fresh blood back to the front line to rotate off another unit that then gets a steroid injection of new fresh troops. So the fact that instead the Ukrainians said, we're just going to build these new brigades from scratch. I mean, this is a lot of troopers. Remember, in 2 years, 4,000 soldier troops we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right, you're talking about basically all of their reinforcements that they've recruited, and then putting them in brand spanking new formations without the experience is really troubling. Now they say, "Oh, it's about their equipment," but the truth is that this equipment is not essential. Right, the essential stuff are FPV drones and vehicles. Right, combat taxis, APCs, and when you have these like newly promoted leaders with limited experience, right? It really creates some serious problems. And as they point out, this points out that what they call inattentive foreign observers, 8 new brigades looks better than reinforcing existing brigades. But the fact is that it's one of those things where when you have, this is, I think, maybe a NATOification problem where NATO does actually, in its rotation, particularly the United States, we rotated at the brigade combat team level. And so NATO mentors may be saying, listen, you have to create new brigades to provide this level of relief. But you really can't do that, right? When you have this level of attrition, it's too risky. It's because the way the global war on terror U.S. military worked was that a unit would deploy, right? Like I was deployed under the 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne. The whole brigade went into country. We were all over the East, like 5 or 6 provinces, right? The whole N2KL area. And they fought for a year, but then the brigade rotated back. But key is that I'd say 30 to 40% of that brigade moved on to other units. And some of them would be gone. So, for example, some might have been reassigned to 10th Mountain. They might have gone to 4th ID. So those brigades who hadn't deployed were in fact getting injections of combat experience via these newly rotated out units, right? And you also had a big shift in leadership. So a lot of units, a lot of guys, I was one of them, who would have gotten promoted, who sort of got their promotions frozen while they were deployed, came back, and then they got bumped up. So I went from being a platoon commander or a platoon leader to a company XO, right? So now my role became more senior, right? Much more complex logistically, but also I was responsible for taking my combat experience and mentoring the platoon leaders that were now in the formation. And so I was able to sit there and go, listen, in today's operational environment, you need to think about X, Y, A, B, and C. These are the real constraints. And I know because I was in country, 90 days ago. And NATO's taking this very sophisticated way of managing people, managing and diffusing combat experience across the formation, and it's applying it to a different war where it just doesn't apply, right? It just doesn't work this way. You cannot, it would be unbelievably dangerous to take a truly brand new NATO brigade, right? It just isn't possible to sit there and go, listen, we can't staff a whole brigade of newly commissioned lieutenants and brand spanking new privates. You can't run a brigade that way. You need experience. And someone I suspect from the US military was probably counseling the Ukrainians to say, oh, do this brigade rotation system, stand up more brigades, rotate them out, blah, 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 blah. But they just didn't appreciate how different the conflict is. And I hope Ukraine is learning from this lesson, and that they instill at the commander level of these of existing brigades to say, listen, you have to tell your people, you have to grow these new troops. We're going to reinforce you, but you cannot treat these new recruits as being less than, as being guys who haven't proven themselves, as being somebody else. You need to put them as close under your wing as possible, and you need to get them combat effective as fast as possible, right? Again, you feel for the units who are just so short on personnel, then to see these personnel just absolutely clown show and take unnecessary casualties as a result. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about is Velka Novosilka. Why? Because this is another case study that we've talked about ad nauseum on this channel, which is where it's like the cycle meme. Russia seizes a town you've never heard of. Everyone proclaims it the most important town of all time. Russia says Ukrainian collapse imminent. Ukrainian army reinforces positions at different town. And that's it. The cycle continues. And Velka Novosilka is the latest operation in that. Russian armed forces patting themselves on the back for having seized Velka Novosilka. In fact, the Russian Ministry of Defense claiming that they've seized the town. Russian sources say they've seized most of the settlement. Ukrainian forces are still in the settlement, though. Who knows what's true? Guys, where is Velka Novosilka? Where is this linchpin? Well, fun fact, where it's not is anywhere near Pokrovsk. It's not Pokrovsk. Right? It's not in Kursk. It's not in the two main efforts of the Russian military. Instead, it's south of Kurakova. And you can see here that it is a town on the low ground on the east side of the Morkalai River. And guys, I hate to, at the risk of sounding like a jerk, it doesn't really matter that much. You can see the only thing that's interesting and noteworthy about it is that it's actually along the route that the Ukrainian armed forces tried to drive in their failed counteroffensive. Staromayorsk, Marakivka, Blahoddatne, right? So, but again, is this itself intrinsically does it have intrinsic value? No. Is it on the route to some other super valuable town? Not really. Again, we're looking, if we zoom back a month, right, there's some argument to be made, that actually Velka Novosilka was some kind of hub that had some value. But again, when you're talking about Russia slowly taking these areas, the Ukrainians have time to plan their defenses. And while it is nice, like it is kind of a hub and there's a lot of roads that lead to it, there's not a lot of roads that lead from it. There's basically two. And if the Ukrainians have blown all these bridges, well, it's just not going to be all that productive for Russia pushing into the northwest. It was, it would have been more productive for Ukrainians, right, when they were on the defense. But again, is this great news? No, it's not good, right? But is it essential? Is it all important? Is it the most valuable thing that's ever happened? No, right? That's probably Russian cope to be like, okay, well, we can't get a victory where we said we were going to, right? We called our shot in Pokrovsk like 6 months ago. They still haven't come close to it. Right? They called their shot in Kursk. They're like, oh, we're going to liberate Kursk. That hasn't happened. So instead, they're just going to pat themselves on the back and be like, guys, the valuable town of Velko-Novosilka, it's done for, baby. We got it. You didn't even know it, but it's actually unbelievably valuable. And it's ours now. Sure thing, boss. I'm just hoping that the Ukrainians were able to get their stuff out. I hope they took minimal casualties. That's what matters. That's what matters in this fight, right? Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all the lieutenant tier folks over on combatvetnews.com. You guys know that's the place to support me. It's my version of Patreon, and we get exclusive combat footage sent to us from the front lines. So you guys get those videos. Link is in the description if you want to pick up a membership. Cheers.